The gunshot echoed through the valley as Harriet Reed clutched her husband's bloodied shirt, tears streaming down her dust-covered face. They'd been married just 3 years when the notorious Colton Gang ambushed their small homestead on the outskirts of Copper Creek, Arizona Territory, 1878. "Thomas!" she screamed, her voice swallowed by the vastness of the desert as the riders disappeared into the distance, leaving her alone with her dying husband and their modest ranch in shambles. By the time the town doctor arrived, Thomas Reed had already passed into the next world, leaving Harriet a widow at 24 in a land that showed little mercy to those who couldn't defend what was theirs. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Reed," Dr. Franklin said, closing his medical bag with a heavy sigh. The bullet pierced his heart. There was nothing anyone could have done. Harriet nodded numbly, her blue eyes vacant as the reality of her situation began to settle in like the dust that coated everything in this unforgiving territory. The following days were a blur of grief and practicality. The townspeople of Copper Creek helped bury Thomas on a small hill overlooking the ranch he'd worked so hard to build. Many offered condolences, but few offered real help. A woman alone couldn't maintain a cattle ranch, they said. She should sell and move back east, they advised. But the East held nothing for her now. Her parents had disowned her when she chose to marry Thomas, a poor rancher with big dreams, instead of the banker's son they had selected. This harsh land was her home now, for better or worse. For 6 months, Harriet struggled to maintain the ranch. She sold half their cattle to hire help, but the men she employed often took advantage, doing half the work for full pay, knowing she had few options. When winter came, bringing with it unusual cold for the territory, her situation grew desperate. The day she rode into Copper Creek to sell more cattle, she overheard the whispers that had apparently been circulating for months. "Poor barren widow," Mrs. Henderson said to Mrs. Collins as they stood outside the general store. Thomas Reed might still be alive if she'd given him sons to help protect their land. "Indeed," Mrs. Collins replied with a nod. 3 years married and not a single child. My Martha had 4 by that age. An empty womb and an empty future, Mrs. Henderson added with a pitying glance in Harriet's direction. "No wonder the Almighty saw fit to take Thomas. What use is a wife who can't fulfill her purpose?" Harriet's cheeks burned with shame and anger as she guided her horse past them, pretending not to hear, but their words cut deeper than any knife. The inability to conceive had been a private grief between her and Thomas, who had always assured her they had time, that children would come when they were meant to. Now, it seemed her personal sorrow had become town gossip. She was tying her horse outside the cattle broker's office when a commotion down the street caught her attention. A stagecoach had arrived, and among the disembarking passengers was a tall man with a weather-beaten face and eyes the color of the sky after a storm. He wore the practical attire of a working cattleman, worn denim, a simple shirt, leather vest, and boots that had seen many miles. Unlike the local cowhands, there was something in his bearing that spoke of experience beyond these territories. The stranger glanced her way, tipping his hat politely before collecting his belongings and heading toward the hotel. Harriet thought nothing more of him as she entered the broker's office to negotiate the sale of more of her dwindling herd. The news wasn't good. Cattle prices had dropped, and the broker offered her barely half what the animals were worth. "Take it or leave it, Mrs. Reed," the balding man said with little sympathy. "It's more than fair for cattle from a failing ranch." "My ranch isn't failing," Harriet protested, though they both knew it was only a matter of time. "Look, I'm being generous considering your situation. A woman can't run a cattle operation, it's just not natural. You should sell the whole property to the Hendersons. They've been looking to expand." Harriet clenched her fists. The Hendersons had been pressuring her to sell since Thomas's death, offering far less than the property was worth. "The ranch isn't for sale," she said firmly, "and I'll take my cattle elsewhere if you won't offer a fair price." The broker laughed. "Where?" "The next broker is 60 miles away, and those cattle won't survive the journey in their condition." Defeated but determined not to show it, Harriet accepted the meager payment and left the office, her steps heavy with worry. She had enough to last perhaps another month, and then what? Lost in thought, she didn't notice the group of men blocking her path until she was almost upon them. "Well, if it isn't the widow Reed," drawled Frank Henderson, Jr., the son of the neighboring rancher who wanted her land. Flanked by his friends, he stood with the confidence of a man who always got what he wanted. "Come to finally accept my pa's offer? Your father's offer is robbery, not a business proposition," Harriet replied, trying to step around them. Frank moved to block her path. "It's more than fair for a woman who can't even manage to give her husband children, let alone manage a ranch." His friends snickered. "An empty womb makes for an empty future, isn't that what they say?" Tears of humiliation threatened, but Harriet forced them back. "Please step aside, Mr. Henderson, or what?" Frank stepped closer, the smell of whiskey on his breath. "You'll set your husband on me. Oh wait, he's dead, because he was fool enough to think a barren woman was worth dying for." Harriet's hand moved to her reticule where she kept a small derringer for protection, but before she could reach it, a new voice interrupted. "The lady asked you to step aside." The stranger from the stagecoach stood a few paces away, his stance relaxed but his eyes alert. He wasn't wearing a gun belt that she could see, but there was something in his demeanor that made Frank hesitate. "This isn't your concern, stranger," Frank said, though he took a small step back. "When a man harasses a lady in the street, it becomes everyone's concern," the stranger replied, his voice level but carrying an unmistakable note of warning. "Now, I believe the lady has business to attend to." For a moment, Frank seemed ready to argue, but after assessing the newcomer, he apparently thought better of it. "We'll talk again soon, Mrs. Reed," he said, gesturing to his friends to follow as he retreated. Harriet released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you, sir, though I could have handled it." The stranger's expression softened slightly. "I've no doubt you could, madam, but my mother raised me not to stand by when I could be of assistance." He tipped his hat. "Owen Zimmerman, recently of Montana Territory." "Harriet Reed," she replied, extending her hand. "What brings you to Copper Creek, Mr. Zimmerman? We don't get many visitors who aren't passing through." "Work, primarily," he said, taking her hand briefly. "I've been hired by the territorial marshal to help address the cattle rustling that's been plaguing the area. I understand it's become quite serious." Harriet's expression darkened. "Yes, particularly for smaller ranches like mine. The rustlers killed my husband 6 months ago." Owen's face showed genuine regret. "I'm very sorry to hear that, Mrs. Reed. Perhaps we could discuss it further. I'm gathering information from all the local ranchers." Harriet hesitated. She needed to complete her errands and return to the ranch before dark, but information about the rustlers who had taken Thomas from her was too valuable to pass up. "I was about to have a late lunch at the hotel dining room," she said. "You're welcome to join me if that would be convenient." Owen nodded. "That would be most helpful, thank you." The hotel dining room was nearly empty at this hour, which suited Harriet fine. She had no desire to endure more whispers and pitying glances. They took a table near the window, and after ordering, Owen pulled out a small notebook. "Tell me about the day your husband was killed, if you don't mind," he said gently. "Any details could be helpful in tracking these men." Harriet recounted that terrible day, how she and Thomas had heard the cattle being driven off, how he'd grabbed his rifle and told her to stay inside, the shots that followed, and how she'd found him bleeding in the dust while the rustlers escaped with a dozen of their best cattle. "Did you see any of their faces?" Owen asked, taking notes. "No, they wore bandanas," Harriet replied. "But their leader had a distinctive horse, a palomino with a white blaze, and one of them called him Colton." Owen's pencil paused. "Jedediah Colton, you know him, by reputation. His gang has been moving between territories, stealing cattle and occasionally hitting banks or stage coaches when the opportunity arises." Owen's expression grew serious. "They're dangerous men, Mrs. Reed. How many hands do you have protecting your ranch now?" Harriet looked down at her plate. "None at present. I couldn't afford to keep them after selling half the herd to pay debts." Owen frowned. "You're alone out there. That's not safe, especially if the Colton Gang knows your ranch is vulnerable." "I have little choice, Mr. Zimmerman. No bank will lend to a woman, and I refuse to sell to the Hendersons for a fraction of what the land is worth." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their food, but also by the unmistakable voice of Mrs. Henderson from the table behind them. "Look at her," the woman whispered loudly to her companion. "Not even cold in her grave and already courting a new man, though what good it'll do her with that empty womb of hers I cannot say." Harriet's face flushed with anger and shame. She set down her fork, her appetite gone. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation elsewhere," she suggested quietly, but Owen surprised her by turning in his chair. "Ladies," he said pleasantly but loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "I couldn't help but overhear your concern for Mrs. Reed. It's heartwarming to see such interest in a neighbor's well-being, though in the future, you might consider expressing it directly rather than through whispers that carry across the room." Mrs. Henderson's face reddened. "Well, I don't imagine you have," Owen replied, still smiling pleasantly. "Experienced true Christian charity, that is. Now, if you'll excuse us, we're discussing matters of ranch security." He turned back to Harriet, whose mortification had given way to astonishment. No one in Copper Creek had ever confronted the Hendersons so directly. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, though she couldn't hide the small smile tugging at her lips. "They're influential in town. All the more reason someone should remind them of basic decency," Owen replied. He hesitated, then added more quietly, "And for what it's worth, Mrs. Reed, there's nothing wrong with an empty womb. It's empty hearts that are the true tragedy." Tears pricked at Harriet's eyes, but she blinked them away. "Thank you for that kindness, Mr. Zimmerman." They finished their meal with discussion of practical matters, how Owen planned to track the rustlers, which ranches had been hit, and what measures Harriet could take to protect herself and her remaining cattle. As they prepared to leave, Owen made an unexpected proposal. "Mrs. Reed, I've been authorized to set up a temporary office while investigating these rustlers. Your ranch's location would be strategically valuable, being on the edge of town but with good views of the surrounding territory." He paused. "I could pay fair rent, and my presence might discourage further trouble. Would you consider it?" Harriet considered carefully. Having a lawman on her property would certainly deter rustlers, and possibly the Hendersons, and the extra income would be welcome. "But a stranger living on her property would certainly set tongues wagging even more. People will talk," she said finally. "People already talk," Owen replied with a shrug. "At least this way you'll have protection and income while I work to bring your husband's killers to justice." Put that way, the decision seemed clear. "Very well, Mr. Zimmerman. When would you like to move your things out to the ranch? Today, if possible. I'd like to start tracking these rustlers immediately." That evening, Owen Zimmerman settled into the small cabin that had once housed Thomas's ranch hands. Harriet provided him with fresh linens and a hot meal, grateful for his presence despite the inevitable gossip it would generate. Over the following weeks, a routine developed. Owen would ride out at dawn to investigate reports of rustling or to follow leads, returning by nightfall to share his findings. Harriet focused on the daily tasks of maintaining the ranch, mending fences, caring for the remaining cattle, and tending her small vegetable garden. On the rare occasions when rain made outdoor work impossible, they would sit at her kitchen table, Owen mapping the rustlers' patterns while Harriet mended clothes or prepared meals. Sometimes they would simply talk about the books they'd read, the places Owen had seen in his work as a lawman, or Harriet's dreams for the ranch once the rustlers were caught. "Thomas and I plan to expand to the north pasture," she told him one evening as they sat on the porch watching a dramatic sunset paint the desert in shades of orange and purple. "Build a proper house instead of this cabin, maybe even plant an orchard where the soil is better near the creek." "It's still a good plan," Owen said. "This land has potential," Harriet sighed. "Perhaps, but without Thomas." "You're stronger than you think, Harriet," Owen said. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the familiarity sent an unexpected warmth through her. "I've seen how you handle this place on your own. Most men couldn't do what you've done these past months." She felt her cheeks color slightly. "Thank you for saying that. Not many in town share your opinion." "Then they're fools," Owen said simply. The conversation might have continued, but a distant movement caught Owen's attention. He stood, reaching for the rifle that was never far from his side. "Get inside," he said, his voice suddenly all business. and stay away from the windows." Harriet complied without question, watching anxiously through a small gap in the curtains as Owen positioned himself behind the water trough, rifle aimed at the approaching riders. There were 3 of them, moving slowly toward the ranch house in the gathering dusk. As they drew closer, Harriet recognized Frank Henderson Jr. at the lead, his face flushed with what was likely alcohol-fueled courage. "Reed," he called out. "Come out and talk business." Owen stood, making his presence known. "Mrs. Reed isn't receiving visitors tonight, gentlemen. I suggest you turn around and head back to town." Frank's surprise was evident even from a distance. "This ain't your property, lawman. We've got business with the widow." "Any business can wait until daylight and proper visiting hours," Owen replied evenly. "Now, unless you'd like to discuss the laws regarding trespassing and harassment, I suggest you leave." For a tense moment, Frank seemed to consider his options. His hand hovered near his pistol, but the steady aim of Owen's rifle apparently gave him pause. Finally, with a curse, he wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over, Reed," he called toward the house. "You can't hide behind a badge forever." As the riders disappeared into the darkness, Harriet emerged from the house, her heart pounding. "What did they want?" "Nothing good," Owen said grimly. "Has Frank Henderson threatened you before?" Harriet hesitated. "Not directly, but his father has made it clear he wants this land, and Frank sometimes drinks more than is wise." Owen's jaw tightened. "I think it's time I had a word with Sheriff Patterson about the Henderson family's approach to negotiations." The next day, Owen rode into town to speak with the sheriff while Harriet tackled the task of repairing the chicken coop. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice the rider approaching until he was nearly at the house. She straightened, wiping sweat from her brow and reaching for the shotgun she now kept nearby, but relaxed when she recognized Dr. Franklin. "Doctor," she called, setting down her tools. "What brings you out this way?" The elderly physician dismounted with a grunt. "Checking on you, Mrs. Reed. Word in town is you've taken in a boarder." Harriet sighed. "News travels fast. Mr. Zimmerman is working with the territorial marshal to catch the rustlers who killed Thomas. He's renting the old bunkhouse while he investigates." Dr. Franklin nodded, his expression neutral. "Sensible arrangement, though you should know not everyone sees it that way, Mrs. Henderson, I presume." Among others, there's talk of impropriety. Harriet felt her temper rise. "There's nothing improper about a business arrangement, Doctor. Mr. Zimmerman stays in the bunkhouse, not the main house." "I believe you," the doctor said gently. "But perceptions matter in small towns like ours. I've known you since you arrived here as a bride, Harriet. I don't want to see you ostracized. For what? Surviving, trying to keep my husband's dream alive." Harriet's voice cracked with frustration. "They mocked my empty womb when Thomas was alive. Now they mock my efforts to save what he built. What would they have me do? Sell to the Hendersons for a pittance and disappear?" Dr. Franklin looked at her with compassion. "No, child, I'm simply suggesting caution. Mr. Zimmerman seems like a good man from what I hear, but he'll leave once his job is done. You'll still have to live in this community." His words hit home, though not in the way he intended. Owen would leave. Of course he would. His presence, his companionship, his respect, all temporary comforts that would vanish once the rustlers were caught. "I understand, Doctor," she said quietly, "but I have to do what's best for the ranch, regardless of gossip." After the doctor left, Harriet found herself unable to return to her tasks. Instead, she walked to the small hill where Thomas was buried, sitting beside the simple wooden cross that marked his grave. "I miss you," she whispered, touching the sun-warmed wood. "I'm trying to keep our dream alive, but it's so hard without you." The wind whispered through the grass, offering no answers, but Harriet found a measure of peace in the silence. Thomas had loved this view, the ranch below, the vast expanse of territory beyond, the mountains in the distance. He had died defending it, defending her. "I won't let them take it," she promised. "Somehow I'll find a way." She was still sitting there when Owen returned from town, his expression troubled as he dismounted and climbed the hill to join her. "Doctor Franklin mentioned I might find you here," he said, standing respectfully at a distance. "Did your meeting with the sheriff go well?" she asked, not yet ready to move from her place beside Thomas. Owen sighed. "Not particularly. Sheriff Patterson claims his hands are tied unless the Hendersons break the law outright. Threats and intimidation are difficult to prove. He paused. There's something else. I've received word that the Colton Gang was spotted near Silver Springs, not 30 miles from here. Harriet's head snapped up. Are they headed this way? It's possible. I'm meeting with some of the other ranchers tomorrow to organize a patrol. He hesitated. Harriet, I think you should consider staying in town until this is over. The Hendersons are trouble enough, but if Colton returns. This is my home, Harriet said firmly. I won't be driven from it by fear. She stood, brushing dust from her skirt. Besides, who would feed the chickens? The weak attempt at humor earned a small smile from Owen, but his eyes remained concerned. At least keep the shotgun with you at all times, and if you see or hear anything suspicious, I'll fire 3 shots in the air as we agreed, she finished. I'm not helpless, Owen. No, he agreed, his expression softening. You're anything but helpless. You're the strongest person I've met in a long time. Something in his tone made Harriet's heart beat faster. She looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that had nothing to do with concern for her safety. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. It was Harriet who finally broke the silence. We should get back. I need to finish the coup before dark. If Owen was disappointed by the change of subject, he didn't show it. I'll help. 4 hands make quicker work than 2. They spent the remainder of the afternoon working side by side, conversation limited to practical matters. But Harriet was acutely aware of his presence, of the casual brush of his arm against hers as they worked, of the way his eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. That night, after a simple supper, Owen returned to the bunkhouse and Harriet to her empty cabin. She lay awake long into the night, her thoughts a confusing tangle of grief for Thomas, worry about the ranch, and new, unexpected feelings for the quiet lawman who had come into her life when she most needed help. Dawn broke clear and cool with the promise of heat later in the day. Harriet rose early, determined to complete her chores before Owen departed for his meeting with the other ranchers. But as she stepped onto the porch with her first cup of coffee, she was surprised to see several riders approaching from the direction of town. Owen emerged from the bunkhouse at the same moment, buckling on his gun belt. Stay inside, he ordered, his hand moving to his revolver, but Harriet recognized the lead rider. It's Sheriff Patterson, she said, setting down her cup. And that's James Tucker with him. He owns the general store. Owen relaxed slightly but remained vigilant as the group approached. There were 6 men in total, including the sheriff and Tucker. None had weapons drawn, but the atmosphere was tense. Morning, Mrs. Reed, Zimmerman, Sheriff Patterson called, reining in his horse. The portly lawman looked uncomfortable, sweat already beading on his brow despite the early hour. What brings you out so early, Sheriff? Owen asked, his tone carefully neutral. Patterson cleared his throat. Got a complaint from Henderson about trespassing. Says you threatened his boy when he came to discuss business. That's not what happened, Harriet protested. Frank and his friends rode up drunk after dark. Owen asked them to leave when they became threatening. Tucker leaned forward in his saddle. That's not how they tell it. According to Frank, they came in peace and Zimmerman here pulled a rifle on them without provocation. And you believe the word of a drunk over a lawman? Owen asked mildly. You're not the law in this county, Patterson replied. You're here on territorial business that doesn't give you authority over local matters. Harriet stepped forward. This is my property, Sheriff. I have the right to determine who can visit and when. The Hendersons were not welcome at that hour. Be that as it may, Patterson said, looking increasingly uncomfortable. There's been concerns raised about your living arrangement here. It's causing talk in town. Harriet felt her face flush with anger. Mr. Zimmerman rents the bunkhouse while investigating my husband's murder. There's nothing improper about our arrangement. No one's saying there is, Mrs. Reed, Tucker interjected with false sympathy, but a young widow living alone with an unmarried man. It doesn't look right. People talk. Then let them talk, Harriet replied, lifting her chin. I'm more concerned with finding justice for Thomas than with pleasing town gossips, the sheriff sighed. Mrs. Reed, no one wants to make this difficult, but Henderson is threatening to bring a complaint of moral impropriety to the county judge. If that happens, you could lose your property." Harriet felt as if she'd been struck. On what grounds? Territorial law allows for property seizure in cases where public morality is at stake, Tucker explained, his expression suggesting he was doing her a favor by explaining. As a widow without family, your standing is precarious. Owen stepped forward, his expression hard. "This is harassment, and you know it, Patterson. Henderson wants this land and is using your office to intimidate Mrs. Reed into selling." The sheriff had the grace to look ashamed. "I'm just delivering the message, Zimmerman. If you were to find other accommodations in town, this whole matter could blow over. And leave Mrs. Reed unprotected against rustlers and Henderson's intimidation." Owen shook his head. "Not happening." "Then perhaps," Tucker suggested, his tone deceptively pleasant, "there's another solution that would satisfy all parties." "What solution?" Harriet asked suspiciously. Tucker glanced at the other men before continuing. "Marriage would resolve the issue of propriety. If you and Mr. Zimmerman were to wed, there'd be no grounds for complaint." Harriet's jaw dropped. "You can't be serious." "It's not an unreasonable suggestion," Patterson said. "Solves the immediate problem, gives the ranch a man's protection, and quiets the gossip." "This is absurd," Owen said flatly. "You're suggesting marriage as a solution to a problem that doesn't exist except in Henderson's imagination." Tucker shrugged. "Just offering an alternative to selling or facing a morality hearing. The choice is yours, of course." He looked directly at Harriet. "Though I'd consider it carefully, Mrs. Reed. Henderson has the judge's ear and your reputation in town is, well, there's been talk since before your husband's passing about certain deficiencies." Harriet felt as if she'd been slapped. They were using her inability to bear children as another weapon against her, implying that her barrenness was somehow evidence of moral failure. Before she could respond, Owen stepped between her and the riders. "I think you gentlemen have said enough," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I suggest you leave now, while this conversation can still be considered civil." The sheriff hesitated, then nodded. "We've delivered our message. You have 3 days to make arrangements. Mrs. Reed, either Mr. Zimmerman finds other lodgings, or Henderson files his complaint." With that, he turned his horse and led the group back toward town. Once they were out of earshot, Harriet sank onto the porch steps, trembling with anger and fear. "They can't do this," she whispered. "They can't take my land because of gossip and lies." Owen sat beside her, his expression grim. "Unfortunately, they can. I've seen similar tactics used before in small towns. The law is vague enough that a sympathetic judge could rule against you, especially if enough respectable citizens testify to impropriety." "What am I going to do?" Harriet asked, more to herself than to Owen. "If I lose the ranch, I have nothing, no home, no income, no future." Owen was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the land Thomas Reed had died to protect. Finally, he turned to Harriet, his expression unreadable. "We could do it," he said quietly. "Do what? Get married." Harriet stared at him in shock. "You can't be serious." "It solves the immediate problem," Owen said reasonably. "The ranch gets protection, Henderson loses his leverage, and you maintain your independence in the long run. But marriage." "Owen, that's a practical solution to an immediate threat," he finished. "It needn't be permanent. Once the rustlers are caught and Henderson's schemes are exposed, we could seek an annulment if you wished." Harriet stood, pacing the small porch. "You're asking me to enter a marriage of convenience with a man I've known barely a month, to let people believe I've moved on from Thomas so quickly, to lie before God and the community." "I'm offering a way for you to keep what's yours," Owen replied, rising to face her. "And yes, the timing is unfortunate, but would Thomas want you to lose everything he worked for because of Henderson's greed and the town's gossip?" "Don't you dare use Thomas to convince me," Harriet said, anger flaring. "You didn't know him." "No, I didn't," Owen acknowledged. "But I know you, Harriet. I know you're fighting with everything you have to honor his memory by preserving what you built together." He took a deep breath. "And I know that, in the short time I've known you, I've come to care for you more than I expected." The simple declaration caught Harriet off guard. She searched his face and found only sincerity in his clear blue eyes. "Owen, you don't need to say anything," he interrupted gently. I understand this is sudden and not what you planned. I'm not asking for love, Harriet. I'm offering partnership, protection, and maybe in time, friendship. Harriet turned away, her thoughts in turmoil. Marriage to Owen would solve her immediate problems, but at what cost? She had loved Thomas deeply. The thought of taking vows with another man, even one as honorable as Owen, felt like a betrayal. And yet, what choice did she have? Sell to Henderson for a fraction of the ranch's worth. Face a morality hearing where her character would be smeared. Return east in disgrace. I need time to think, she said finally. Owen nodded. Of course, I have to meet with the other ranchers about the Colton Gang. I'll be back by sundown. He hesitated, then added, whatever you decide, Harriet, I'll respect it. After he rode away, Harriet found herself drawn once again to Thomas's grave. She sat beside the wooden cross, tears flowing freely now that she was alone. What should I do, Thomas? She whispered. I don't want to lose our home, but marriage to Owen. Is it wrong to even consider it? To think I could find happiness with someone else when you've been gone such a short time? No answer came except the gentle wind through the grass. Harriet remained there for hours, thinking, praying, remembering. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, she finally stood, her decision made. When Owen returned that evening, Harriet was waiting on the porch, her expression composed but resolute. I've thought about your proposal, she said as he approached, and I have conditions. Owen's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. I'm listening. First, this remains a business arrangement. We present ourselves as husband and wife to the town, but privately we maintain separate quarters. Agreed. Second, if either of us wishes to dissolve the arrangement once the rustlers are caught and Henderson's threat is neutralized, we do so amicably. Of course. Harriet took a deep breath. Third, we are honest with each other in all things. No secrets, no hidden agendas. Owen nodded. I wouldn't have it any other way. Then, yes, I will marry you, Owen Zimmerman, to save the ranch and for no other reason. If her words hurt him, Owen didn't show it. He simply extended his hand, which she shook formally, sealing their agreement. We should do it quickly, he said. Before Henderson can file his complaint. Tomorrow, Harriet agreed. We'll ride into town and find the minister. And so, on a bright morning in early spring, Harriet Reed became Harriet Zimmerman in a brief ceremony at the small church in Copper Creek. The only witnesses were Dr. Franklin, who had always shown Harriet kindness, and the minister's wife. No announcement had been made, no invitation sent, but somehow, by the time they emerged from the church, a small crowd had gathered. Mrs. Henderson was among them, her face pinched with disapproval. Well, she said loudly as Harriet and Owen descended the church steps, I suppose that solves one problem, though I can't imagine what good a barren wife will do a virile young man like yourself, Mr. Zimmerman. The crowd fell silent, waiting for Owen's response. Harriet felt her face burn with shame, but Owen merely smiled, taking her hand firmly in his. Mrs. Henderson, he replied, his voice carrying clearly, when Harriet told me they mocked her empty womb, I told her, then let's fill it with hope. And that's exactly what we're doing, building a future based on hope, not fear or spite. He looked directly at the older woman. I'd invite you to the celebration, but I'm afraid your heart might be too full of bitterness to make room for joy. With that, he led Harriet to their waiting horses, leaving Mrs. Henderson sputtering in indignation and the crowd murmuring in surprise. As they rode back to the ranch, Harriet found herself speechless. No one had ever defended her so publicly, so completely. You didn't have to say that, she finally managed. About hope. Owen glanced at her, his expression softening. I meant every word, Harriet. This may have started as a practical arrangement, but that doesn't mean it can't grow into something more if you're willing. For the first time since Thomas's death, Harriet felt a flicker of possibility. Not love, not yet, but perhaps the beginnings of something that might, with time and care, bloom into it. I'm willing to try, she said quietly. The weeks that followed were a strange dance of public unity and private uncertainty. To the town, they presented the image of a happily married couple. Owen openly handled ranch business, repelled Henderson's continuing attempts to buy the property, and led efforts to track the Colton Gang. Harriet, freed from some of the burden of defending her right to remain on the ranch, focused on expanding their vegetable garden and repairing long-neglected structures. At home, they maintained separate quarters as agreed, Owen in the bunkhouse and Harriet in the main cabin. But they shared meals, conversations, and increasingly, confidences. Owen spoke of his childhood in Pennsylvania, his journey west after the war, and his work as a lawman. Harriet shared stories of her early life in Boston, her parents' disappointment when she chose Thomas over their preferred suitor, and her dreams for the ranch's future. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the nature of their relationship began to change. It happened in small moments, Owen's hand lingering on hers when passing the coffee, Harriet finding herself watching for his return each evening, both of them sitting closer together on the porch as they watched the sunset. One evening, as summer heat gave way to the first cool breath of autumn, Owen returned from a 3-day absence tracking rustlers. Harriet greeted him with relief that surprised even her in its intensity. "I was beginning to worry," she admitted as she served him a hot meal. "Did you find any sign of them?" Owen nodded, his expression grim. "The Colton Gang hit the Maxwell place yesterday, took 20 head and shot old Maxwell when he tried to stop them." Harriet gasped. "Is he?" "He'll live, according to the doctor, but it was close." Owen pushed his plate away, suddenly serious. "Harriet, the gang is moving this way. The pattern suggests they'll hit the Henderson Ranch next, and then possibly ours. What can we do?" "I've organized a patrol with men from the neighboring ranches. We'll take shifts watching the likely approach routes." He hesitated. "I'd feel better if you stayed in town until this is over." Harriet shook her head. "This is my home, our home now. I won't be driven from it by fear." Owen sighed, but there was pride in his eyes. "I knew you'd say that." "In that case, we need to prepare. The house should be fortified, and you need to know exactly what to do if they come while I'm on patrol." They spent the evening planning moving furniture to block windows, preparing emergency supplies, establishing signals. As they worked, Harriet found herself watching Owen, his capable hands, the determined set of his jaw, the way he anticipated her needs before she voiced them. "Thank you," she said suddenly. Owen looked up from the rifle he was cleaning. "For what?" "For everything. For helping me keep the ranch. For treating me like a partner, not a burden. For—" She hesitated, then finished softly, "for giving me hope when I thought I had none left." Something shifted in Owen's expression, a guardedness giving way to naked emotion. He set the rifle aside and crossed to where she stood. "Harriet," he said, his voice low, "I need to tell you something. When I proposed this arrangement, I told you it was purely practical, that I was offering partnership and protection." He took her hands in his. "That wasn't entirely true." Harriet's heart quickened. "What do you mean?" "I mean that from the first day I saw you standing up to that broker in town, something in me recognized something in you. Your courage, your determination, your heart." His thumbs traced gentle circles on her palms. "The practical reasons were real, but they weren't my only motivation for suggesting marriage." "Owen, you don't have to say anything," he assured her quickly. "I know you're still grieving Thomas, and I would never presume to replace him. I just needed you to know the truth. Because I promised honesty between us." Harriet looked up at him, this man who had come into her life so unexpectedly and changed it so completely. In his face, she saw respect, admiration, and something more, something that made her heart flutter with both fear and anticipation. "I think," she said carefully, "that Thomas would want me to be happy, to live fully, not just survive." She took a deep breath. "And when I'm with you, Owen, I feel like I'm living again, not just existing." Owen's eyes widened slightly. "Harriet, are you saying—" Whatever question he meant to ask was lost as the sound of a gunshot echoed from the direction of the north pasture. Owen was instantly alert, reaching for his rifle. "Stay here," he ordered, moving to the window to peer into the darkness. More shots followed, accompanied by the distant sound of cattle bellowing in panic. "It's them," Owen said grimly. "The Colton Gang, they're hitting us now." He turned to Harriet. "Bar the door behind me and get the shotgun. Don't open for anyone but me, understand?" Harriet nodded, fear and determination warring within her. "Be careful, Owen." He paused at the door, looking back at her with an intensity that took her breath away. "I will come back to you, Harriet, that's a promise." Then he was gone, slipping into the darkness as Harriet barred the door and positioned herself at the window, shotgun ready. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, punctuated by distant gunfire and shouting. Harriet remained vigilant, her mind racing with worry for Owen and determination to defend her home if necessary. Finally, the gunfire ceased. The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the chaos had been. Harriet strained her ears for any sound of Owen's return, but heard nothing. Just as she was considering whether to risk opening the door to look for him, a soft knock came. "Harriet, it's me," Owen's voice called. "It's over. You can open the door." Relief flooded through her as she unbarred the door, but it quickly turned to horror as Owen stumbled inside, one hand pressed to his side, blood seeping between his fingers. "Owen," she gasped, dropping the shotgun to help him to a chair. "You're hurt." "It's not bad," he grunted, though his pale face suggested otherwise. "Just a graze. Did the job, though. Colton's dead and his men are either captured or fled." Harriet was already gathering bandages and hot water. "Let me see," she insisted, gently moving his hand from the wound. The bullet had indeed grazed his side, leaving a deep furrow that bled freely but wasn't life-threatening. With steady hands, Harriet cleaned and bandaged the wound, her relief growing as color slowly returned to Owen's face. "You need to rest," she said when she'd finished. "You've lost blood." Owen caught her hand as she turned to put away the medical supplies. "Harriet," he said softly, "before the shooting started, we were talking about something important." Despite everything, Harriet felt herself blush. "You should rest now, we can talk tomorrow." But Owen shook his head. "Almost dying has a way of clarifying what matters, Harriet, and what matters to me is you." His eyes held hers. "I love you. I think I have from the moment I saw you facing down those gossips in town with your head held high, and I need to know if there's any chance you might someday feel the same." Harriet's heart seemed to stop, then race ahead. The words she'd been afraid to acknowledge even to herself were suddenly clear as day. "I already do," she whispered. "I love you, Owen. I tried not to because it felt like betraying Thomas, but he would want me to be happy and you. You make me happier than I ever thought I could be again." The joy that bloomed on Owen's face was worth every moment of doubt and fear that had preceded it. He pulled her gently closer, mindful of his injury, and when their lips met, it felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. Their marriage, begun as a practical arrangement, blossomed into something neither had dared to hope for: a deep, abiding love built on respect, shared purpose, and the courage to begin again. 2 years later, as summer warmth gave way to autumn's first chill, Harriet stood on the porch of their new house, larger than the cabin but still modest, built with care on the hill overlooking the expanded ranch. In her arms, she held a miracle. Their 3-month-old daughter, Rose, named for the wildflowers that had bloomed on Thomas's grave the day Owen had asked Harriet to marry him for love rather than convenience. Owen joined them on the porch, wrapping an arm around his wife's waist as they gazed out at their thriving ranch. The Henderson threat had long since faded. Frank had moved east after his father's death, and the new neighbors who bought their property had proven to be good friends. The town, too, had changed. New settlers brought fresh perspectives, and even Mrs. Henderson had grudgingly accepted the Zimmerman's place in the community, especially after Rose's birth had proven the whispers about Harriet's barrenness to be nothing but cruel gossip. "What are you thinking about?" Owen asked, kissing Harriet's temple as Rose slept peacefully in her arms. Harriet smiled, leaning into his embrace. "About hope," she said softly. "About how you promised to fill my empty womb with it, and how that hope grew into so much more than either of us expected." Owen's arms tightened around them both. "The best kind of promise," he murmured, "the kind that keeps giving even after it's been fulfilled." As the sun set over the land they had fought so hard to keep, painting the desert in shades of gold and purple, Harriet reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from grief to partnership to love. The empty spaces in her heart, once filled with sorrow, now overflowed with joy and possibility. And in that moment, watching the day end with her family in her arms and their future spreading before them like the vast western sky, Harriet knew that hope, once planted, could bloom even in the harshest desert, bringing life where once there had been only barren ground.